The elevator doors were almost closed when a hand slid in and forced them back open, and Mrs. Patel stepped inside smelling of fried onions and laundry detergent and said, in that half-whisper people use when they actually want to be heard, "Do you know who comes to your apartment every Tuesday when you're out?" I was holding my grocery bag in one hand and my keys in the other. They rattled a little. My fingers tightened around the old brass one, the one that doesn't fit anything in this building, but that I still keep, heavy and useless, on the ring. I live alone on the 7th floor. My husband, George, has been gone 3 years. My daughter Laura says she worries about me up here in Mississauga, outside Toronto, all on my own. Lately, her worry has started to feel like a hand on the back of my neck, gentle but always there, steering. The elevator began to move, and the light hummed overhead, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "What do you mean every Tuesday?" I asked. My voice came out thinner than I liked. I'm 81. I do not like sounding like a piece of tissue paper. "There is a man," she said, eyes bright the way they get when she has something. "And your daughter, I think. They come with folders, papers. They were there last week when I came up with my grandson. I thought maybe you were home, but your door was closed. Then yesterday I saw them again. You were not on the balcony, so I thought—" She shrugged, a small, sharp movement. The elevator stopped at 5, and a young woman got on with headphones and the smell of cold outside, clinging to her coat, and whatever Mrs. Patel was about to say curled back into her mouth. We rode in silence up 2 more floors. Early March light was leaking in through the tiny, smudged window by the door, all gray and flat against the parking lot, slush, and the bare little trees along the sidewalk. When the doors opened on 7, Mrs. Patel pressed her hand to my arm. "You should ask your Laura," she said. "Sometimes young people do things they think are helping." She smiled in that way that is supposed to be kind, but there was something else there too, a warning, a little thrill. I walked down the carpeted hallway that always smells faintly of someone's dinner and the bleach they use on Thursdays, my keys still in my hand. The condo building is quiet at this time of day. Just the hum of the vending machine at the end of the hall and the distant thump of a TV from number 709. I stopped at my door. The new silver key slipped into the lock with a neat little click. The old brass key on the ring brushed my thumb, cool and familiar, its teeth worn smooth over decades of use in another house, another door, another life. I unlocked the deadbolt and went inside. My unit is small but bright. 2 bedrooms, one I sleep in and one I pretend is an office, even though the desk is more of a landing pad for mail and half-finished knitting. The kitchen is narrow, the way they make them in condos, and my mug rack is on the left, even though Laura keeps telling me it makes more sense on the right, closer to the dishwasher. "You don't live here," I told her once when she tried to move it. She laughed like I was being cute and moved it back anyway. The heat kicked on with a whoosh from the vent. I set the grocery bag on the counter and just stood there for a moment, listening to the apartment settle around me. The fridge hummed. A car horn honked down on the street. Above me someone started a vacuum. "Every Tuesday," she'd said, with papers. I thought of last Tuesday and the one before, the pattern of the new life I've built since George had his heart attack in his sleep and left me sitting at our old kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in my hands. Tuesday mornings are for physio. My left knee complains if I skip. I take the bus 2 stops down Hurontario, let the young driver lower the ramp for me, even though I can manage the steps, and I do my exercises with the other old ladies while a young man named Kyle tells us to squeeze our glutes. After that, I usually stop at the pharmacy, maybe the bakery. I like to get home by 1 to make my sandwich. For the last few months, though, Tuesdays have also meant Laura. "I can only do afternoons that day, Mum," she told me back in January, scrolling through her phone with her thumb, the way she does. "Work is insane. Tuesdays are predictable, so let's make that our day, okay?" I remember the way she said, "our day." Warm, final, like a done deal. "I'm not a dentist appointment," I said. She smiled over the rim of her latte. We were at the little cafe near the lake, the one with the good lemon squares. "You're my mother," she said. "You get your own day." We didn't talk about what it meant that the rest of her week was already claimed by conference calls and teenagers and whatever else filled her life. So, Tuesdays. Last week, I came home from physio to find her in my kitchen with a man I had never seen before. She was leaning against my counter, a stack of papers between them, my old brass key lying right on top of the pile, the thin red ribbon I'd tied through it years ago, trailing off the edge of the laminate. "Mom," she said, bright and slightly too loud. "This is Eric, remember? I told you? From the bank." Eric had one of those firm, dry handshakes and a tie with small blue dots. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, smiling like he'd practiced that exact smile in a mirror. "Pleasure to meet you. We've just been looking over a few things to make sure everything is nice and straightforward for you." I looked at my kitchen table. My kitchen, my table, my placemats I'd picked up on clearance at HomeSense, the ones with the little olive branches printed on them. Laura had pushed them aside to make room for the documents. I put my purse on the chair by the window, the one that gets the best light in the afternoon, and hung my coat on the hook behind the door. "I don't remember agreeing to a bank visit," I said. My knee was throbbing, and I wanted my sandwich. I wanted my apartment to look like my apartment again and not like a small conference room. Laura rolled her eyes just a little, the way she did when she was 15, and I asked where she was going after school. "Mom, we talked about this," she said. "You keep telling me you don't understand the bills. You said you want things simpler. Eric is helping us." Us, not me. Us. George and I handled our money together. We sat at the long oak table in our old house in Clarkson, the one we bought in 1978, and spread out the envelopes and balanced the checkbook by hand, his big fingers smudged with ink from signing his name. The first time he handed me the key to that house, he did it in the driveway, the for sale sign still squeaking in the wind behind us. "Here you go, Evie," he said, dropping the brass key into my palm. "You're the queen of this castle now." The metal was hot from the August sun, and I remember thinking it felt like power, like responsibility, like we had done something enormous and adult. I had put that key on my ring and never taken it off, even when we sold the house after the stroke that slowed him down, even when we moved into the smaller bungalow, and then later, after he died, when I let Laura talk me into this condo. I'm not the queen of this castle, I thought then, looking at her and Eric at my own kitchen table. I'm a guest. "It's just some small changes to your accounts," Eric said, and he smiled again, professional and smooth. "So, if anything ever happened, your daughter could help you more easily. Think of it like, He paused, searching, like giving someone a spare key. You still live there, but now if you lock yourself out, they can let you in. He seemed rather pleased with his metaphor. I looked at the brass key on top of the papers. The red ribbon was fraying at the edges where I twisted it around my fingers when I watched TV. "I'm not locked out," I said. Laura put her hand over mine, patting twice like I was a cat she didn't want to disturb. "Mom, you don't need to understand all the tiny details," she said. "That's why I'm here. That's why Eric is here. Just trust me on this, okay? We're making sure everything is safe. You always told me to be responsible." There was the slightest edge under the word responsible. A reminder. When she was 10, I forgot to pick her up from Brownies one rainy November evening because George's mother had fallen in the kitchen and I was at the hospital with her. Laura never lets me fully forget it, not even now. I sat down slowly. The chair creaked the way old chairs do, a sound I usually find comforting. Today, it sounded like a protest I didn't quite have the energy to make. Eric slid a form towards me and laid a pen beside it. "We'll just add Laura as a joint holder on this one," he said. "Nothing changes in terms of your day-to-day. It just gives more flexibility if we ever need to act quickly." I glanced at the lines of text that blurred together in tiny print. The letters swarmed. My left eye has been worse since the cataract. I held the pen but didn't click it. "What if I don't want to act quickly?" I asked. Laura's smile tightened. "Mom, please," she said. "We've gone over this. I have to get back to the office in half an hour. Can you just sign so we can finish?" It was the "can you just" that pricked. Can you just move into a smaller place? Can you just stop driving at night? Can you just let me handle this? 100 little justs that add up to a life shrunk down to something that fits in the spaces other people leave you. I signed. I did. I watched my hand do it, neat little Evelyn Hughes looping across the bottom of the page, and I tried not to feel like I had just given something away. When they left, Eric tucked the papers into his folder, and Laura picked up the brass key, twirled it once, and set it back on my ring. "You really don't need to carry this old thing anymore," she said, laughing. "It's dead weight." "So am I some days," I said lightly. She didn't laugh at that. She kissed my cheek, soft and quick, and told me to text her if I needed anything. After she'd gone, I stood in the quiet kitchen and held the key up to the light. The grooves were worn shiny in places where years of turning had smoothed them out. It was useless, true. It opened a door that belonged to another family now, but my hand knew its weight. My thumb settled into its familiar notch. That was last Tuesday. Now, after the elevator and Mrs. Patel's narrowed eyes, I moved through my condo room by room, looking for what I already knew I wouldn't find. Nothing obvious was different. The throw blanket on the sofa was folded the way I fold it, in thirds, not in half. The small wooden box with the important papers in it was still on the top shelf of my bedroom closet behind the extra set of sheets. I pulled it down anyway. My fingers left faint powdery prints in the dust on the lid. Inside, the folders were in the same order: wills, insurance, house sale documents, bank things. George's handwriting on some of them, mine on others. I could smell paper and the faint ghost of his cologne he spilled in there once and wiped up with an old T-shirt. I touched the envelope with our first mortgage statement inside, the ink now fading to a grayish blue, and felt a little twist in my chest. I put everything back and pushed the box into its corner. The effort made my knee complain. In the kitchen, I made tea and set the old brass key by the mug. Steam rose and fogged my glasses for a moment. Outside, snowflakes started drifting down, lazy and half-hearted, not enough to stick. The condo felt smaller than it had that morning when I left for groceries. Mrs. Patel's words pressed against the walls. I picked up the phone and dialed Laura before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring, out of breath. "Hey, Mom, I'm in between meetings. Can we make it quick?" Papers rustled on her end. I could picture her in her office downtown, the one I've only seen in photos, a plant on the windowsill, some framed certificates on the wall to show she belongs there. Have you been coming here when I'm out?" I asked. I forced my voice to stay steady. "Mrs. Patel said she saw you. With a man? On Tuesdays?" A short silence, then a little laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said. "Mrs. Patel needs a new hobby. Yes, I've been by a couple times with the real estate guy to look at the building. He wanted to see a unit. It was convenient." "My unit," I said. I could feel my grip tighten around the phone, the plastic case pressing into the soft pad of my palm. "You were in my apartment without me here." "Mom, you gave me a key," she said, like that settled everything. "I only used it because it made sense. We didn't touch your stuff. We were in and out. Eric has been trying to convince me to think ahead, that's all." The key. I looked at the ring on the table, the old brass key lying next to the new silver one, the one I'd handed to her last year after my fall in the hallway, when the world went gray for a moment and I woke up with a paramedic leaning over me. "In case there's an emergency," she had said then, holding up the key. "I need to be able to get to you." I had dropped it into her hand because my hip hurt, and the morphine was making my tongue thick. "I thought it was for emergencies," I said now. That's not an emergency, Laura." A little sigh crackled in my ear. "It is, Mom," she said. "Maybe not the kind you think. You're 81. You live alone. You have more space than you need. The market is good now, but it might not be in a year. We're just exploring options. I was going to talk to you when things were more concrete. I didn't want to stress you out before we had to." She said stress, like I was a fragile object wrapped in tissue paper. "It's my home," I said quietly. "I know where I live," she said, a touch of irritation now. "I'm trying to help. Anyway, I really do have to run. We'll talk on Tuesday, okay? I'll come by after lunch. Love you." "Love you," I said, because the words are a path we've worn between us, and I don't know how not to walk them. The line went dead. I sat at the kitchen table, my hand still around the phone, my tea cooling untouched. The old key lay there, its red ribbon curling like a question mark. Help, help, help. Everyone is always helping me these days. The doctor who tells me not to climb stools. The nice young man at the phone store who insists on setting everything up for me while I stand there like a child waiting to be told what button I'm allowed to press. Laura, with her spare key and her folders and her real estate man, walking through my rooms while I'm stretching my hamstrings at physio. I took a sip of tea. It had gone lukewarm and thin. The taste reminded me of the last winter George was alive, when he kept forgetting his mug on the table until it turned cold, and he'd say, surprised, "When did I pour this?" The memory tightened my throat, and for a moment the anger, the confusion, the ache all folded together into something that just felt like tiredness. Later that afternoon, I put on my good coat and wrapped my scarf twice around my neck. The wind had picked up sharp and damp off the lake. I took the bus down to the little branch of my bank on Dundas, the one in the strip mall between the dry cleaners and the nail salon. The automatic doors whooshed open and warm, slightly stale air greeted me, along with the faint sound of someone laughing behind the counter. There was a bowl of wrapped mints on the desk and a poster about retirement planning with a couple in matching sweaters staring out at an ocean. I walked up to the young woman at the front, the one with the neat bun and kind eyes who once helped me figure out how to deposit a check with my phone. "I'd like to talk to someone about my accounts," I said. My voice felt stronger here, surrounded by numbers and forms and all the things people think old ladies can't understand. "Of course, Mrs. Hughes," she said, looking at her computer. "Let me see who's free." She sent me to sit in a glass-walled little office with 2 chairs and a fern that had seen better days. A man in his 30s joined me after a moment, introduced himself as Michael, and pulled up my file on his screen. "So," he said, smiling in that professional way, "what can I help you with today?" I folded my hands in my lap and felt the brass key press into my thigh through the fabric of my coat. "I just want to understand what changes were made," I said. "Last week, with my daughter, there was another man here too. Eric." I watched his face carefully. His eyebrows rose half a centimeter when I said Eric's name. "Ah, yes," he said. "I see here you added your daughter as a joint holder on your main account and gave her power of attorney for finances. That's what we did last Tuesday. Power of attorney." I knew the words in a vague, cloudy way, like you know the lyrics to a song you last heard on a car radio 15 years ago. They didn't belong in my mouth. They belonged in hospital hallways and in whispers over sick beds. "In simple terms," Michael went on, and he was doing his best, I could tell, to keep it gentle. "It means she can manage your money for you. She can sign where you would sign. When you add someone like this, Mrs. Hughes, it means they can use the money just as you can. It's like giving someone a spare key to your front door. You still live there, but they can come and go without needing to ask you first." The spare key metaphor again. Maybe they taught it in a training session. I stared at his tie, which had tiny diagonal stripes, and let the words, "use the money just as you can," settle somewhere behind my ribs. "Even if I don't agree?" I asked. My voice sounded far away. "Well," he said, and he shifted in his chair, his careful smile faltering. "You agreed when you signed the form, but if you have concerns, there are things we can talk about. It's your life, Mrs. Hughes. Your choices matter. Your choices matter." He said it like he meant it, but there was something in his eyes, too, a kind of practiced distance, the knowledge that whatever happened with me would be one of many such conversations he had in a week. I nodded like I understood everything and thanked him. He printed out a summary for me, 3 sheets of paper that rustled when I slid them into my purse, next to the little packet of tissues and the mint I'd taken from the bowl but hadn't eaten. On the bus ride home, I sat by the window and watched the gray buildings slide past, the piles of dirty snow, the little flashes of color from winter jackets and store signs. The brass key was in my hand now, my fingers wrapped around it so hard the metal edges bit into my skin. I remembered all the times I'd turned it in that old front door, coming home with screaming babies and then with sulking teenagers, and then alone after George's shifts at the factory, after long afternoons at my mother's bedside. That key had always meant I could step inside and close the world out, that what happened in that house was ours to decide. Now my home could be viewed and measured and discussed while I wasn't even there, by people carrying clipboards and little laser measures, and I might not know until it was already decided. In the condo lobby, the air felt cooler than outside. The light from the big front windows washed everything pale. I nodded at the security guard and rode the elevator up alone this time. No Mrs. Patel, no half-whispered questions, just the quiet whir of the motor and my own reflection in the dull metal wall. Coat buttoned up to my chin, white hair neatly pinned back, eyes a little more tired than I like to admit. At my door, I paused. The new silver key slid into the lock smoothly. I didn't turn it yet. I stood there, the hallway carpet under my sensible shoes, the faint smell of someone cooking onions drifting under a nearby door, and looked down at the key in my hand. The brass one lay on my palm beside the silver, one that opens a door that no longer belongs to me, one that opens a door that might not, if I wasn't careful, belong to me much longer either, at least not in the way that matters. My fingers closed around both. The metal warmed slowly against my skin. Behind me, someone's TV laughed, and the elevator dinged in the distance, and I felt something inside me, something that had been lying very still for a long time, shift slightly, like a person adjusting in a chair when they realize they've been sitting in the same position for hours. I turned the new key at last and stepped into my condo, the familiar creak of the floor by the hall table greeting me, and I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the dimness, my hand still closed around the two keys, listening to the steady tick of the clock on the wall and the soft hum of the refrigerator. And for the first time in a long while, instead of wondering how to be less of a burden, I found myself wondering, quietly but firmly, how I might hold on to what was still mine. That question sat with me like a third presence in the room as the afternoon dimmed and the light on the balcony glass turned from gray to the faint yellow of the parking lot lamps flickering on outside. And I found myself still standing in the little hallway with my coat half off, my fingers curled around both keys until my knuckles ached. So I made myself move one small action at a time, slipping my coat on the hook, setting my purse in its place on the chair, laying the keys down deliberately in the ceramic dish by the door, instead of on the table the way I usually do. And as they landed with a soft clink that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet, I realized I was trying to hear the difference between giving something up and putting it somewhere I could find it again. Then the clock in the living room chimed 4 in its mild electronic way. And it struck me how strange it was that I'd lived more than 8 decades and somehow still didn't quite know what to do when the people who say they love you start moving your furniture around in a life you thought you'd already arranged. So I went into the kitchen and turned on the kettle, because, at the very least, I know what to do with hot water and a tea bag. I moved slower than usual, not because my joints complained any more than they did yesterday, but because my mind felt busy, like a drawer that's been yanked open, and now every spoon and rubber band is rattling around, refusing to settle. And as I reached for my favorite mug, a chipped white one with a blue stripe, the one George bought me at Canadian Tire the same day we picked out the first lock for the old house, I noticed my hand hesitate halfway, like it was trying to remember something, and then I saw it. The small screw I'd dropped last week when I tightened the loose handle on the cutlery drawer, still sitting on the corner of the counter where I'd left it for a second that turned into days. And for some reason, that bothered me more than it should have. So I picked it up and put it in the little tin where I keep nails and spare hooks and the tiny Allen wrenches that come with flat-pack furniture. And the steadiness of that simple act of putting something back in its rightful place calmed me enough to take a breath that felt like it actually reached my lungs. After my tea, I took out the folder Michael had printed for me at the bank and laid the pages on the table, smoothing them with my palm the way I once smoothed wrinkled permission slips and report cards, wanting to understand what I was signing my name beneath, and the words looked like they always do. Too many, too small, arranged in blocks that seemed designed to exhaust you before you reached the part that mattered. But there it was, in the middle of the second page, my name and Laura's name tied together by phrases like joint account and authority to transact, and that heavy little pair of words, power of attorney, which on the paper sat politely between commas, but in my chest settled like a brick. I traced the letters of my own name with the tip of my finger, the loops of my Y and G identical to the way I wrote them on birthday cards and grocery lists. And then I looked at Laura's name above mine, her handwriting nowhere in sight. Just neat typed letters that didn't capture how she still dots her I a fraction higher than she needs to, because she learned cursive in a hurry back when they still taught it properly. And I thought of all the times I'd signed my name for things that were ours: the mortgage, the car loan, the condo purchase, the consent forms when she needed her tonsils out, and George was on shift and couldn't get away, the paper they handed me in the hospital when they asked if I wanted them to keep trying to do everything for him or not. And I remembered how the pen felt that day, heavier than any key I'd ever held. The papers blurred and the words slid for a moment, and I realized my eyes were filling, so I sat back, closed them, and let myself drift to another room, another desk, another key. We were in the lawyer's office when we first made wills, late autumn of 1999, the Y2K fuss humming in the background of everyone's mind, the maple trees outside the window almost bare, and George had his good shirt on with the collar. He always complained choked him, and he kept fiddling with his key ring, the metal jingling softly in his pocket, until I nudged him with my foot under the table, and he stilled. The lawyer was a soft-spoken man with a gray mustache who explained in calm, measured sentences what would happen with the house, with our small investments, with the safety deposit box at the bank. And he used that same language about keys, how we were deciding ahead of time who we wanted to give the key to if we couldn't open the door ourselves. And back then, it had felt like we were being sensible, like parents fastening helmets on their kids before a bike ride, imagining falls, but assuming everyone would get up again and ride home for supper. We chose each other first, of course, and then, as a backup, we wrote Laura's name. "She's good with these things," I'd said, even though at the time she was more interested in boy bands and theater club than in bank statements. "She'll grow into it." And George, bless him, had smiled and said, "Our girl could run the world if she wanted," and signed his name with the easy confidence of someone who fully expects to be the one taking care of everyone else for a long time. Now, in my little condo kitchen, the hum of my refrigerator sounding faintly like the old lawyer's fan, I realize that somewhere between then and now, between our confidence and this quiet fear pressing into my shoulder blades, the meaning of that key had shifted, and I wasn't sure when I'd stopped feeling like the one giving someone access and started feeling like the person whose door might be opened without her even knowing someone was reaching for the knob. The phone rang that evening just after I'd finished washing up my dinner bowl, the water still warm in the sink, and when I answered, it was my granddaughter, Sophie, her voice bright and tinny. "Hi, Nana," she said. "Mom's stuck on another call and she told me to check in on you." And the phrase "told me to" made something small in me wince. "Well," I said, drying my hands on the tea towel, "consider me checked." She laughed, that lovely bubbling sound that is pure Laura at 15 and yet completely her own. And we talked about her math test, her friend's new puppy, the drama teacher who apparently has no sense of time. I listened, made the right noises, asked the right questions, felt the warmth of being needed in a way that didn't involve forms or signatures. And then, as we were saying goodbye, she said, "Oh, and Mom wanted me to remind you she'll be over Tuesday, okay?" She said, "Don't schedule anything." The words, "don't schedule anything," sat heavy between us. "I have my physio," I said, "but after that, I'm gloriously free." "Cool," Sophie said, and I could hear her keyboard clicking, multitasking the way young people do. "Okay, love you, Nana." After we hung up, I wiped the counter a little longer than necessary, then glanced toward the ceramic dish by the door. The keys lay there, the brass and the silver side by side, like two versions of the same story. I picked up the brass one and slipped it into my cardigan pocket without overthinking it. It felt like something quietly rebellious, the way it did when I used to sneak chocolates into my purse to bring into the movie theater before they started checking bags. And the sensation made me smile in spite of myself. The next day was Friday, which for me means laundry and the seniors' coffee group down in the community room on the main floor. It's a plain space, stackable chairs, a couple of folding tables, a kettle that has seen better days, a notice board with curling flyers about flu shots and bingo. But I like it. There's a big window that looks out onto the little strip of grass by the parking lot, and someone always brings store-bought cookies and passes them around like they made them themselves, and we trade stories and aches and casseroles. That morning, snow was swirling lazily outside, not quite deciding whether to commit, and Mrs. Patel was there in her pale cardigan, stirring too much sugar into her coffee. She caught my eye as I poured myself some and made her way over, eyebrows raised. "You spoke to your daughter?" she asked quietly. I appreciated that she didn't pretend she hadn't planted the seed. "I did," I said, keeping my voice level. "She's exploring options." I added the last part with a little wry twist, the way Laura had said it, as if my life was a menu she was reading. Mrs. Patel said, taking a sip. "Children think ahead in ways we don't always like. My son, he wants me to move into his basement. He calls it a suite, as if that makes it better." She smiled, but her eyes did not quite. "They come with boxes and ideas, but they forget we are not boxes." I felt an odd kinship with her then, one old woman recognizing another on the deck of the same slowly listing ship. On the notice board, among the flyers for yoga and tax clinics, there was a new poster I hadn't seen before. It had big letters that said, "Know Your Rights, Seniors and Your Money," and underneath, in smaller print, "Free information session this Monday at the community center, presented by Legal Aid. All welcome." There was a picture of two hands, one old, one young, holding a house key between them, of course. I stared at that image longer than necessary, the way the younger hand was on top, the older one underneath, and I heard myself say, almost casually, "That looks interesting." "You should go," Mrs. Patel said immediately, following my gaze. "I cannot. My grandson has his little play. But you have more patience for these things." I almost said, "I'm fine," the automatic response that comes so easily, the verbal shrug of someone who does not want to cause trouble. Instead, I reached out and pulled one of the little tear-off slips at the bottom of the poster, even though I didn't need the phone number. Sometimes the act of taking a thing is its own commitment. "Maybe I will," I said. On Monday, the snow had crusted into a thin, dirty layer along the sidewalks, and the air hurt my nose when I breathed in, but the sun was bright, and the sky the kind of hard winter blue that, weirdly, always makes me think of laundry pegged on a line. I put on my boots, tucked the brass key into my coat pocket again, and took the bus a few stops to the community center. The room for the session smelled faintly of gym floor and coffee. There were maybe 15 of us, mostly women with the same practical coats and sensible shoes, a few men with hats they didn't take off, and at the front, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a stack of pamphlets. She introduced herself as Sarah from Legal Aid and began to talk about financial abuse, a phrase that made me bristle even though she said it gently, and about how sometimes help can slide into control without anyone noticing at first. Her explanations were short, clear. She talked about powers of attorney in 2 or 3 sentences, about how useful they can be when someone is truly unable to manage, and how dangerous if someone uses them like a lever instead of a support. "Think of it like lending your house key to someone," she said. Of course she did. And there was a murmur of recognition in the room. Ideally, they come in only when you invite them or in an emergency. But if they start rearranging your furniture without asking, that's a problem. The key is still yours. You decide who holds it, and you can change your mind. I felt my fingers tighten around the brass key in my pocket, as if to anchor her words to something solid. The session wasn't long. She kept her explanations brief, maybe because she knew our attention spans, or maybe because she understood that too much information can feel like being buried. She invited questions at the end, and for a moment I sat there, heart thudding, arguing with myself. "Don't make a fuss," one part of me said, the part raised to be a good girl who doesn't cause scenes. The other part, the one that remembered standing in front of our first house with the August sun on my shoulders and the key hot in my palm, raised its head. My hand went up. "What if?" I began, and my voice wobbled until I cleared my throat. "What if you've already signed and you're not sure you understood what you agreed to? What if your child, who you love very much, has started using that authority in ways that feel like they're deciding things before you're ready?" The room was suddenly very quiet. A couple of women nodded, almost imperceptibly. Sarah's face softened. "Then you are exactly who we're here for," she said. "You can change or cancel a power of attorney as long as you still understand what you're doing. We help people with that all the time. It's your life. You're not a passenger." After, while most people shuffled out to catch their rides or pick up grandchildren, I hung back. My heart was still beating too fast, but my feet stayed where they were. Sarah came over, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Do you want to chat?" she asked. I nodded. We sat at a table by the window, winter light pooling on the scratched surface, and I told her, haltingly, about Laura, about the bank, about the condo, about Mrs. Patel and the Tuesdays, and the man called Eric, who smiled like a brochure. I heard myself apologizing for Laura as I spoke, as if I had to protect her from judgment even in absentia, telling Sarah what a good daughter she was, how busy, how overwhelmed. "It doesn't sound like she's a bad person," Sarah said when I paused, and there was no accusation in it, just acknowledgement. "It sounds like she's scared and maybe she's used to being in charge. But you're still allowed to say no. You're allowed to say, 'Not yet,' or 'Not like this.' That doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you an adult with preferences." We talked for only a few minutes. She kept it, as promised, simple. She wrote a phone number on the corner of a pamphlet and circled it. "If you want to talk more about your specific documents, call this number," she said. "We can set up an appointment. And remember, it's like changing the locks. You don't have to justify it to anyone if you decide that's what you need. You're the owner of your own front door." I tucked the pamphlet into my purse, feeling the paper edge against my fingers like a new kind of key, one I wasn't sure yet if I would use. On the bus home, the world outside slid by again. Strip malls, tired snowbanks, a woman in a red coat walking a dog that looked like a mop with legs. I sat with the brass key in my left hand and the pamphlet in my right, weighing them like two sides of a scale. When I got back to the building, the lobby smelled of wet wool and the faint lemon cleaner they use on the floor. There was a small pile of flyers on the table by the mailboxes, one of them about a new digital door entry system the condo board was considering. "We're updating," the notice said. "Safer and more efficient." It mentioned key fobs and access codes and things that sounded suspiciously like ways to keep track of who was coming and going. I felt a silly rush of protectiveness for my old brass key, which had nothing to do with this building and would never beep at a sensor or blink a little light. Upstairs, in my hallway, I paused again by my door. The habit of reaching straight for the silver key was strong, but this time I stopped myself and took the brass one out instead, fitting it into the air just in front of the lock, as if imagining a door it could still open. My hand remembered the motion so well that for a second I could feel the phantom resistance of the old tumbler in our Clarkson house, the satisfying give as it turned. "You did your job," I murmured under my breath, feeling faintly ridiculous and yet also comforted. "You kept us safe." Then I slipped it back into my pocket and used the silver key to actually get inside. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I rearranged a drawer purely because I wanted to. The junk drawer in the kitchen, the one Laura rolls her eyes at and threatens to tackle every time she visits, had become a small universe of its own. Elastic bands, bread ties, a dead flashlight, take-out menus, 3 different screwdrivers. I pulled it out, carried it to the table, and spread everything out. The act of deciding what belonged and what didn't, of throwing away old batteries and lining up pens that still worked, felt unexpectedly powerful. I found, at the very back, a little brass padlock we'd once used on a locker at the Y. tiny and a bit tarnished, its key taped to it so we wouldn't lose it. I peeled the old tape away and held the minute key between finger and thumb, amused at the echo, keys upon keys, layers of access and control. I opened the padlock, closed it again, testing its stubbornness. It clicked in a satisfying way. That evening, I took the legal pamphlet out again and read it more slowly. The language was kinder than the bank's documents, but still firm. Words like revocation and capacity and witness marched down the page. At the bottom, there was a small box with a sample statement. I, name, cancel the power of attorney given to name on date. It seemed almost too simple, like untying a knot you thought was permanent and finding the rope slips free with one tug. You're not making that call tonight, I told myself aloud, surprising myself with how bossy I sounded. You're thinking. The clock ticked in the living room, quietly stubborn. On Tuesday, Laura came. I had not canceled anything. I had not spoken to a lawyer. The pamphlet was back in my box, tucked between George's pension papers and the letter from the funeral home I can't bring myself to throw away. But I had done something small. I had moved the hook where I usually kept my keys, the one Laura reaches for without looking, from the wall by the door to the inside of the hall closet. It was a minor deviation in the map of my home, a tiny way of saying this space answers to me. I could always say I did it because I thought it looked nicer. Old women are expected to fuss with decor. When Laura arrived, I heard the scrape of her key in the lock before she rang the bell, the metal-on-metal sound making my shoulders inch up toward my ears. I opened the door before she could use it. "Hi, Mom," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek as she stepped past. She looked tired, that smudge under her eyes I recognized from the mirror in my own years of juggling work and family. She set her purse on the chair, shrugged off her coat, and looked around with quick eyes that always seemed to be cataloging something. "You moved the keys?" she said almost immediately, glancing at the empty spot on the wall. I felt a small flicker of satisfaction that she noticed. "Yes," I said. "I liked them in the closet better. The wall looked cluttered." "Okay," she said, drawing the word out, just a fraction, the way she does when she's wary. "Whatever works." She took her own key ring out of her purse and dropped it into the ceramic dish, the little silver condo key landing with a faint ring. The brass key in my pocket felt suddenly heavy, as if it wanted to announce itself too. We made tea and sat at the table. I'd baked banana bread the day before, partly because the bananas were going brown, and partly because I needed something to do with my hands, and she helped herself to a slice, eating it standing, glancing at her phone. I watched her, taking in the familiar curve of her shoulders, the little crease between her eyebrows that deepens when she's concentrating. "We need to talk about the condo," she said finally, sliding her phone face down on the table, that sign that she was giving me her full attention, whether I wanted it or not. "Eric found a couple of buyers who are very interested in units in this building. If we list soon, we can probably—" "Before we talk about listing," I said, cutting in as gently as I could, my heart giving a hard thump at my own interruption. "I want to talk about something else." She stopped, blinked, and for a second I saw the little girl whose monologues about her day I used to interrupt only to insist she eat a vegetable. "Okay," she said slowly. "What's up?" My fingers found the outline of the brass key through the thin fabric of my cardigan. "I went to the bank," I said, and to a session at the community center about powers of attorney. Her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Mom, I told you, it's just so I can help you," she said. "You don't have to worry about—" "I'm not worried about the idea of help," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "I am worried about being stepped around, about things happening in rooms I'm not in, about people walking through my home when I don't know they're here." There it was, the thing itself laid on the table between us like another document. She looked at me, really looked, and I saw irritation and concern and a flash of guilt all flicker through her face before she settled on a kind of measured patience. "Mom, I was going to tell you once there was something to tell," she said. "I didn't want you to get upset over possibilities. We haven't signed anything with a buyer. We're just exploring options." "Exploring?" I repeated. "I know, but the exploring is happening with my name on the door and my teacups in the cupboard." I gestured around the kitchen. "This is not a vacant property, Laura. It's my life." Silence. The clock on the wall ticked loudly enough to make itself a participant. She sighed and sat down, banana bread half eaten on her plate. "I'm trying to keep you safe," she said, quieter now. "You fell last year. You're lonely up here. The condo fees keep going up. If we sell while the market is good, we can get you into somewhere with more support. A retirement community, maybe, or a smaller place near us. You'd have people around all the time. You wouldn't have to worry about bills." There was genuine love in her words. Fear, too. I could hear her imagining finding me on the floor or dealing with my paperwork while also juggling her teenagers and her job. I understood deeply. Understanding did not erase the sting. "When your father and I bought our first house," I said quietly, "we were younger than you are now. Everyone told us we were taking on too much, but we decided together. We turned the key together. That mattered." Her eyes softened at the mention of George. "I know," she said. "You and Dad were always a team. I'm doing this without him, and it's scary for me too." We sat there, two women with the same jawline, decades apart, fear wearing different coats on each of us. I could feel the brass key under my palm now, where I'd slipped my hand into my pocket, its ridges pressing faint little crescents into my skin. "I went to legal aid," I said. "They told me I can change my mind about the power of attorney if I want." The words dropped between us like small stones in still water. Laura's eyes widened. "Mom," she said slowly, "why would you do that? Do you not trust me?" It was the hurt in her voice that undid me more than anything. Trust. Of course I trusted her. Trusted her to show up, to worry, to push when she thought she was right. Trusted her to act. It was myself I needed to trust again. "I trust that you love me," I said. "I trust that you mean well. I'm not sure you always see me when you're planning. Sometimes I feel like you're holding the key and I'm just standing on the porch, waiting to be told where I'll live." Her eyes glistened and she blinked hard. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I've been the one doing everything since Dad died, sorting the funeral, the pensions, helping you move, visiting every week. You don't see how much I'm carrying." "Maybe I don't see all of it," I said gently. "Just like you don't see me sitting here reading every line of these forms, trying to keep up. Maybe that's the problem. We've both been busy and in different rooms." She looked away toward the window, where the light was thin and cold on the balcony railing. The condo felt suddenly very small, as if our words were taking up space the furniture used to occupy. "So what do you want, Mom?" she asked finally, turning back. "Spell it out, because if you're going to yank back the power of attorney, I need to know what you expect me to do when things go wrong, because things do go wrong. That's life." I opened my mouth. The answer sat there, half-formed. "I want you to consult me, to slow down, to let me be in the room where my life is being discussed. I want my key back, metaphorically speaking, without losing you. I want to know what holding on to what's mine actually looks like at this stage of life." The clock ticked, the fridge hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly. I didn't say all of that, not yet. Instead, I tightened my fingers around the old brass key in my pocket, feeling its familiar shape, as if it could remind me who I had been at every door I'd ever unlocked. And I took a breath that tasted of banana and tea and something sharper, the edge of a choice, and began slowly to answer. I began slowly, the brass key warming in my palm, as if it had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. And I told Laura that what I wanted, what I needed, was not to turn back time or pretend I wasn't aging or insist on doing everything alone, but to be treated as someone still capable of deciding the direction of her own life, someone still allowed a say in what happens inside her own four walls. And I watched her face shift, soften in some places and pinch in others, the way it used to when she was a child, trying to understand a rule that didn't make sense to her, but that she knew she had to live with. And I said that I didn't want to yank everything from her hands, didn't want her to feel abandoned or untrusted, but that I needed her to see that help offered without listening first can feel like a hand covering your mouth instead of holding your arm. And she sat back in her chair then, her fingers loosening on her mug, her shoulders dropping as if something heavy had just slid off of them. And she whispered, "I don't want to control you, Mom. I just want you safe." And her voice cracked on that last word. So I reached across the table, my hand trembling a little, and laid it on hers. And for a moment we just breathed in the same small kitchen where the smell of banana bread still lingered and the clock kept its steady, stubborn rhythm against the wall. And she said, "Tell me how to help the way you want to be helped." And those words felt like the click of a lock giving way, a gentle sound, almost invisible, but unmistakable. I told her I needed the power of attorney paused, not destroyed, just set aside until we could both sit down with someone neutral, maybe Sarah from Legal Aid or Michael from the bank, and talk through exactly what it meant for both of us and whether it was truly necessary right now. And I told her I needed her to stop bringing strangers into my home when I wasn't here, that if she wanted to look at options, we would do it together, in rooms where I had a chair and a voice. And she nodded, a little stiff at first, but then again with more conviction, as if she heard the difference between defiance and dignity. And she said she could do that. She could slow down. She could let me lead sometimes, even if it scared her, especially because it scared her. And she asked tentatively, "Can we talk to someone about the condo without deciding anything yet, just to understand?" And I said yes, because understanding is not betrayal. And she smiled in that small, tired way that reminded me of her first weeks home with her newborn daughter, when she learned that love and exhaustion could occupy the same square inch of skin. After she left, the condo settled back into its familiar quiet. the light thinning into evening as the sun slipped behind the buildings across the street. And I stood at the hall closet and looked at the hook where my keys now hung, the silver one gleaming and the brass one dull with age beside it, and something inside me, some small pilot light that had been flickering uncertainly these past months, steadied a little, as if it remembered how to burn without asking permission. And I sat on the sofa where George used to fall asleep during hockey games and took out the pamphlet Sarah had given me, the edges softening from the number of times I had read it, and I dialed the number she circled, not to revoke anything yet, but to book a conversation, a real conversation, one where I could ask every question without feeling rushed or foolish. And when the woman on the other end said, "We can meet Thursday at 11, I said, "Yes, that works." And after I hung up, I held the brass key in my hand again, its familiar weight settling into my palm, the way truth settles into a person who has spent too long doubting herself. And I thought about all the doors I have opened in my life. The first apartment George and I rented, with the floral wallpaper that peeled at the corners, the house in Clarkson where Laura learned to walk across hardwood floors that creaked louder near the pantry, the bungalow where we spent the last years before his heart gave out on a quiet spring night, and this condo, this small but sunlit place where I have learned that being alone is not the same as being diminished. And I whispered to the key, "You are still mine," even though it opened nothing now but memory, and I felt something settle, low and warm, like a lantern placed gently back on its hook after a long journey. On Thursday, I met with Sarah in a small room at the community center, the smell of coffee and old linoleum settling around us like a familiar blanket, and she helped me review my documents, not with fear or urgency, but with clarity, and she explained, again briefly, again kindly, that changing a power of attorney was like resetting the locks on a door whose hinges were still strong. And after listening to everything, she suggested a compromise, a limited power of attorney, one that gave Laura the ability to help only in specific situations, not all, and one that required my consent for major decisions, something that reminded both of us that I was still the one holding the front door key to my own life. And when she placed the form in front of me, it felt less like signing away something and more like reclaiming the terms of my own existence. So I signed, not out of fear, but out of steadiness. And when I handed the papers back to Sarah, she said softly, "You're setting a boundary, not a wall." And that sentence stayed with me all the way home on the bus, the city slipping past in late winter slush, and the sun reflecting on dirty snow that still shimmered in its own way. That evening I called Laura, and she answered on the second ring, her voice soft, almost tentative, and I told her what I had done and why. And there was a long silence in which I could almost hear the gears shifting in her mind. And then she said, "Thank you for telling me, and thank you for trusting me enough not to shut me out." And I told her I wanted her help, just not her decisions in my absence. And she said she understood, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, I believed her. Not because she had suddenly changed into someone different, but because I had finally begun to speak from a place I hadn't touched in years, a place that remembered being capable, being central, being the woman who once ran a household with lists and laughter and the quiet, unglamorous courage so many of us live our entire lives without naming. That night, after we hung up, I sat on the sofa with a cup of chamomile tea and looked at the clock on the wall, the same one I'd bought in a little shop downtown 2 years after George died, the one whose second hand sometimes sticks for a breath before jerking forward, and I realized how much of my life lately had felt like that. Paused, waiting for someone else to tap the mechanism and set it moving again. And without meaning to, I reached up and adjusted a small screw on its frame, and the second hand began to move in a smooth, uninterrupted sweep, quiet but steady, and I felt a subtle easing inside me, as if a part of me I hadn't known was clenched had released. A week later, Laura came on Tuesday, not with papers or a man from the bank, but with a lasagna she'd made herself. And when she stepped into the condo, she looked around, not like someone appraising a property, but like a daughter visiting her mother. And she said, "It smells good in here." And I laughed because all I'd done was warm a little cinnamon in a pan to mask the scent of the cleaner I'd used on the counters. And as we sat together at the table, eating warm slices of her lasagna, she said, "I'm proud of you, you know." And I blinked at her because it had been a long time since she'd said anything like that. And she added, "You're teaching me something, Mom, that helping doesn't always mean leading." And I touched the brass key in my pocket, its ridges pressing into my fingertips like a quiet affirmation, and I told her, and I'm learning something too, that accepting help is not the same as surrendering. And she smiled with her whole face the way she used to when she was young, and for the first time in a long time, our conversation felt like two women sitting together, not one carrying the other. After she left, I stood by the balcony window and watched the street lights blink on one by one, the light pooling out across the parking lot like small soft promises, and I realized that the fear of being erased, of being treated like someone who had already stepped halfway out of her life, had loosened its grip, not because the world had changed, but because I had found my way back into the center of my own small orbit. And when I went to place my keys in the ceramic dish, both keys side by side, I paused, holding the brass one a moment longer before letting it go. And for the first time, its weight felt not like memory clinging, but like memory supporting. A reminder that every chapter of my life had taught me something about staying present, staying seen, staying whole. And as the clock ticked across the room in its newly steady rhythm, I whispered a thank you to the quiet that had taught me to hear myself again. And I turned out the lights, knowing that dignity, once reclaimed, glows even in the smallest darkened room. Now, my dear listener, before we part ways tonight, I want to speak to that place inside you that might have felt something stir as you heard my story. That small, quiet ache that comes when you've spent too many years making yourself smaller so others don't trip over you. And I want you to know that those feelings, the confusion, the guilt, the fear of disappointing the people you love, are not signs of weakness, but signs that your heart has been carrying too much without being asked whether it agreed to the load. And if you found yourself nodding along, feeling seen in the spaces where I once felt invisible, trust that your own voice, however soft it may sound right now, still belongs in every room where your life is being discussed. And I want to gently encourage you, in whatever way feels right, to take one small step toward the boundary you've been afraid to draw. Maybe it's a conversation. Maybe it's a pause. Maybe it's simply putting your own emotional key back on the hook where it belongs. Because even the smallest boundary can feel like turning a light back on in a dim hallway, reminding you that the door to your life is still yours to open and yours to guard. And just like my old brass key, even the objects we think have lost their purpose can guide us back to the parts of ourselves we thought we had misplaced. And now I want to ask you something. If you were standing in my kitchen that day, with documents on the table and a loved one making decisions faster than your heart could follow, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have found your voice the way I finally did, even if it trembled at first? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, not out of curiosity, but because stories like ours soften when shared. And if this journey resonated with you, I hope you'll subscribe so we can walk together through more tales of family, courage, and quiet self-respect. Remember, people learn how to honor your life from the way you honor it yourself, even in the gentlest ways. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.